It began with thunder, the kind of storm that splits the night and rattles windows in their frames. Raven Hollow wasn't used to violence, not from the sky, and certainly not from its people. Yet on the Rowan property, the storm ripped into the soil around a tree everyone feared and everyone avoided. Harold Rowan had guarded that oak with his life. He was gone now, but the rule he lived by, "No one touches the oak," echoed in every neighbor's mind. Still, no one could explain why. Until Shadow, the family's German shepherd, began to circle the roots like a soldier sniffing out the battlefield. His barks were frantic, his body tense. He wasn't warning of weather. He was warning of something darker. By morning, a sliver of black plastic glistened from the wet soil. Lila reached for it with a child's innocence, but Shadow lunged, teeth bared. Not at her, but at the secret she was about to touch. From that instant, the silence of Raven Hollow cracked wide open. What lay beneath the oak was no myth, it was proof, and it demanded to be seen. Raven Hollow was the kind of town where people measured time not by clocks, but by the seasons. Summers stretched long and heavy, heat clinging to the wooden porches. Winters came sharp, ice glazing the rooftops and silencing the streets. And in every season, from the beginning of memory to the present day, the oak tree on the Rowan property stood like a sentinel. The Rowan house itself wasn't remarkable. A two-story farmhouse with peeling white paint and shutters that no longer hung quite straight. Its porch sagged in the middle, as if weary of decades of footsteps pacing back and forth. But behind the crooked fence and weathered barn, the oak rose above everything else, massive, ancient, its trunk thick as four men linking arms. The branches curled upward like gnarled hands clawing at the sky. In the early morning mist, its silhouette looked less like a tree and more like a monument to something too old to name. Folks in Raven Hollow called it the Silent Giant. Children dared each other to run up and touch its bark, but almost none did. They'd sprint halfway across the yard, stop cold, then retreat, glancing nervously at the Rowan windows as if someone might be watching. Because in Raven Hollow, everyone knew Harold Rowan's rule, one he repeated as often as a prayer: "No one touches the oak." The words were simple, but in Harold's mouth they hardened into stone. He said them at church picnics, in line at the post office, even once at Ruby's diner, when the conversation had turned to storms and fallen trees. "No one touches the oak," Harold declared, his fork pausing mid-air. And when a neighbor asked why, Harold's only reply was a silence so long and so cold that the question died in the air. It became habit then, for people not to ask. Small towns have long memories, and Raven Hollow was no different. They remembered the feuds that stretched back to great-grandfathers, the land disputes that never made it to court, but never died out either. In such a place, when a man set a rule, you respected it, even if you didn't understand it. And so the oak remained untouched. Still, behind curtains and on back porches, people whispered. Some swore Harold had cursed the tree himself, binding it to protect his land. Others claimed his father before him had once buried something beneath it, something so dangerous Harold had spent his life guarding it. A few old-timers said the oak was older than the town itself, planted on land where terrible things had happened long before Raven Hollow was built. But never, not once, did anyone dare step across the fence to find out. The Rowan property sat on the northern edge of town, where the asphalt roads crumbled into gravel and fields stretched like patchwork quilts. Travelers driving through often slowed their cars, eyes drawn to the towering oak rising against the horizon. It was impossible to miss. Even from miles away, it stood apart from the maples and pines, its branches stretching wider, its crown taller. At dusk, when the last light of day dipped behind it, the tree cast shadows long enough to reach across the road. Children riding bicycles home from school pedaled faster at that hour, eager to escape its reach. And if the wind happened to whistle through the branches, it sounded, at least to those with imagination, like whispers. For Harold Rowan, the oak was more than a tree. It was an anchor, a boundary line, a silent partner in his life. He had fought men off it more than once. Old Jensen, who lived 2 houses down, swore that back in the 70s, Harold had run him off the property with a shotgun after he leaned a ladder against the trunk to trim branches for firewood. "Never seen eyes so cold," Jensen would mutter, shaking his head decades later, like the man was protecting more than bark, and maybe he was. For all Harold's stern rules and heavy silences, he was not a man who explained himself. His children grew up under the oak's looming shadow, warned never to carve initials in its bark or climb its branches. His granddaughter, Lila, was too young to know the depth of his warnings, but she understood the sharp tone he used whenever she wandered too close. Even in his last years, when his legs were stiff and his hands shook, Harold never failed to look out the window toward the oak each evening, as if expecting it to betray him. When Harold Rowan died that spring, Raven Hollow mourned, but uneasily. The church pews filled with neighbors offering condolences, yet their eyes drifted toward the Rowan property, as though the tree itself might follow them home. Some whispered that the curse would lift with Harold gone, that the rule no longer held. Others, more superstitious, warned that disturbing the oak now would be tempting fate. The funeral ended as funerals in small towns often do, with casserole dishes passed around, condolences murmured, and gossip simmering just below the surface. And in every whispered conversation, the oak was mentioned. What will happen to it now? Will the family finally cut it down? What if Harold was right to protect it? But in truth, the oak stood unchanged, silent, watching. By the time summer settled over Raven Hollow, the Rowan house looked lonelier than before. Its windows reflected nothing but sky, and its porch sagged heavier without Harold's boots on the boards. Yet the oak was as alive as ever, its leaves a darker green than the rest, its roots gripping the soil like fists. It was as if the earth itself recognized the tree's importance, feeding it with a strength the other trees lacked. And still, the rule echoed. Though Harold was gone, his words lingered like a ghost over the property. No one touches the oak. Neighbors avoided the road if they could. Children who once dared each other to touch the bark now only whispered the challenge. Even the church pastor, a man not prone to superstition, admitted quietly to Ethan Ward one evening, "That tree gives me chills, like it's holding on to something it shouldn't." Ethan, young officer in uniform, only nodded. He couldn't explain it either, but he knew one thing for certain. The German shepherd at his side, Shadow, never took his eyes off that tree. And sometimes, late at night when the wind carried strange sounds through Raven Hollow, it seemed the oak itself was listening. For 5-year-old Lila Rowan, the yard was more than grass and fences. It was a castle without walls, a kingdom spread wide beneath the Missouri sun. The cracked porch steps were her throne, the garden path her royal road, and every flutter of wings above the flower beds was a knight in her court. Barefoot, curls bouncing, she darted through the summer air with the abandon only children knew. In her hand, she carried a stick she'd christened a wand. With it, she declared the rules of her kingdom. Sunflowers were towers, daisies were dancers, and the butterflies that drifted lazily on the breeze were messengers delivering secret news. Wherever she went, Shadow followed. The German shepherd was more than twice her size when he stood tall, his dark coat gleaming under the sun. The townsfolk knew him as Officer Ward's K9 partner, a working dog with discipline, strength, and instincts sharpened by training. But to Lila, he was a knight sworn to her side, a guardian who trotted patiently as she weaved through the grass. She spoke to him as if he were a fellow child. "Catch the butterfly, Shadow, but don't hurt it. Just tell me what it says." The dog's ears twitched at the sound of her voice. He didn't leap or chase, not the way an untrained dog might, but his eyes followed the delicate wings, scanning the air with a soldier's precision. Lila giggled, twirling in the sunlight. Her laughter filled the yard, rising above the hum of cicadas. From the porch, her mother glanced out the window and allowed herself a small smile. For a child who had lost her grandfather only weeks ago, Lila seemed resilient, too young to fully grasp what death meant, and still living in the glow of imagination. But if her mother had looked closer, if she had studied Shadow's posture, she might have noticed the tension in his muscles. Each time, Lila's small steps drew her closer to the oak. Shadow's demeanor changed. He slowed, ears pricked forward, tail lowering until it hovered near the ground. His dark eyes sharpened, fixed not on the girl, but on the tree itself, as though it had moved when no one was looking. Lila, oblivious, darted toward the oak's roots in pursuit of a monarch butterfly, her wand trailing behind her like a banner. But Shadow surged forward, planting himself between her and the sprawling roots. A low growl rolled from his chest, subtle at first, then deepening until it vibrated through the air. The girl stopped short, nearly stumbling into his side. She blinked up at him with wide blue eyes. "Shadow, what is it?" She reached out her small hand, brushing his fur. "It's just a tree." The dog didn't move. His body formed a wall, his head lowered, his nose twitching furiously at the base of the oak. His growl wasn't aimed at her. It was aimed at the ground. Lila tilted her head, the way children did when faced with something they couldn't understand. She crouched beside him, patting his back. "Grandpa always said you were silly about the tree." "Didn't he, Shadow?" She spoke with the easy certainty of a child, but her voice wavered just a little, as if, deep inside, she knew her grandfather's rule had never been a joke. The oak loomed above them, its bark darkened by years of storms, its branches twisting high into the sky. In the sunlight, it should have been beautiful, but in moments like this, it cast a different shadow, longer, colder, as if its roots whispered secrets through the soil. Shadow's growl rumbled on. Lila frowned, her small face earnest. "You don't have to be scared. I'm not scared." But even as she said it, she took a half step back, her gaze flicking upward into the branches. A breeze rustled the leaves, and for just a second, it did sound like whispers. The girl tightened her grip on her stuffed wand. Then, with the quicksilver resilience of childhood, she shook it off and skipped back toward the flowers. "Come on, Shadow. We have to finish the parade." Shadow followed, but he didn't relax. His ears remained sharp, his eyes scanning over his shoulder toward the oak. Every few steps, his growl threatened to return, as if he couldn't let go of what his senses told him. For Lila, the yard was still a playground, but for Shadow, it was a battlefield. He recognized something beneath the surface, something buried where human eyes saw only dirt. And though Lila's laughter rang bright as bells, it was always punctuated by the low rumble of her guardian's warning. Later that afternoon, when the sun sagged low and the cicada's drone grew heavier, Lila collapsed onto the porch steps, cheeks flushed, hair damp with sweat. Shadow sat beside her, his flank pressed against her small shoulder. She leaned against him without hesitation, her breath slowing into contented sighs. "You're my knight, you know," she whispered, tracing a finger over his collar. "Grandpa said you were always watching, and he was right." Shadow didn't move. His chest rose and fell, steady as a drumbeat, but his eyes never left the oak. Even in the fading light, even with the world quieting around them, he remained fixed on the tree. Lila noticed, just barely. She followed his gaze for a moment, then frowned. "It's just a tree," she repeated softly, as if saying it aloud could make it true. But when the evening breeze carried the faint creak of the branches, she shivered and pressed herself closer to Shadow's side. For the first time that day, her kingdom didn't feel so safe. The funeral of Harold Rowan drew nearly the entire town of Raven Hollow. Not because he had been beloved. Harold had never been the kind of man who invited affection, but because in a place this small, death was both a duty and a spectacle. The church bells tolled low, their echoes rolling across the cornfields, summoning neighbors in dark suits and dresses that smelled faintly of mothballs. Inside, St. Matthew's Chapel. The air was heavy with flowers, lilies and roses arranged in vases along the altar, their perfume battling the musty scent of wood pews polished too many times. At the front rested the casket, simple oak with brass handles, closed tight. Harold's children had argued about whether to leave it open for viewing, but in the end, no one had the courage. Lila sat in the front pew, her legs dangling, feet nowhere near the floor. She clutched her stuffed rabbit against her chest, more interested in the stained glass windows than in the hushed prayers. She didn't understand why grown-ups whispered behind tissues, why her mother's hand squeezed hers so hard. To her, Grandpa Harold was simply gone, like when the sun set and shadows stretched across the yard. But to the rest of Raven Hollow, Harold's absence meant something more. Even in the quiet of prayer, voices hummed low in corners, spilling into the air like gnats. "Stubborn man," one neighbor muttered near the back. "Kept to himself too much." Another leaned close. "Always had that rule about the oak. Never did sit right with me." A third, voice sharp with old memory. "You forget he ran Jensen off his land with a gun just for touching that tree. That wasn't protection. That was madness." The oak hung over the funeral even though it stood miles away. Its shadow stretched into every conversation. People didn't speak of Harold without speaking of the tree. Sheriff Marcus Doyle stood along the side wall, arms crossed, his wide frame blocking half the aisle. He was a man weathered by 3 decades of service, gray hair at his temples, deep lines bracketing his eyes. He shook his head quietly as the gossip circled, not because he disagreed, but because he had heard it all before. He had been called to the Rowan property more than once in his career. Disputes with neighbors, complaints about threats. Each time, Harold's eyes had carried the same warning. Stay away from the oak. Now Harold was gone, and Doyle felt the weight of something unfinished pressing against him. Near the back of the chapel sat Officer Ethan Ward, his uniform crisp though his collar itched under the heat. At 28, he was still proving himself, still carrying the invisible burden of being the young one among seasoned men. He didn't gossip like the others. Instead, his gaze drifted from the casket to the faces in the crowd, reading the unease written there. He couldn't explain it, but something about the service left him unsettled. Funerals were supposed to close chapters, to wrap lives neatly with hymns and condolences, but this one felt different, like a door creaked open rather than closed. Outside, as the service ended and the procession spilled into the graveyard, the summer wind picked up. The trees along the hillside bent and whispered, their leaves hissing against one another. Leela skipped beside her mother, more curious about the flapping ribbons on the wreaths than the solemn march to the cemetery. Shadow walked too, though no leash tethered him. He moved with controlled steps, dark coat gleaming, his body taut with awareness. While others looked ahead to the fresh-dug earth and the polished gravestone, Shadow's ears pricked and his eyes turned north, toward the Rowan property, toward the oak that loomed unseen but never absent. The dog froze at the crest of the hill, his nose lifted, twitching at the breeze, and a low rumble started in his chest. Ethan noticed, slowing his own steps. He crouched briefly, his hand brushing the dog's fur. "Easy, boy," he murmured. But the growl didn't stop. Shadow wasn't looking at the grave. He was looking at the horizon where the tree stood. Ethan's stomach tightened. At the graveside, the pastor spoke the final words, his voice carrying over bowed heads. Harold Rowan was laid to rest beside his late wife, the earth thudding softly as it fell on the casket. People crossed themselves, whispered prayers, and soon began to drift away, back to cars, back to kitchens and quiet routines. But no one left without a glance exchanged, a question unspoken. What happens to the oak now? Patty from Ruby's diner whispered to Mrs. Ellison, "You think they'll cut it down?" Mrs. Ellison clutched her rosary tighter, shaking her head. "Some things aren't meant to be touched. That tree's one of them." Sheriff Doyle overheard. He didn't correct her. He simply adjusted his hat and stared long at the Rowan property line, visible across the fields. His jaw worked silently, the way it did when a case gnawed at him. As the last shovel of dirt was smoothed over the grave, Ethan lingered. He watched Lila kneel to place a flower, her small hand trembling slightly. She whispered something to her stuffed rabbit, something only children and secrets could hear. Shadow remained by Ethan's side, stiff and alert, his gaze never wavering from the northern horizon. His body radiated tension, every hair along his spine bristling against the wind. And though the day was bright, though the grave was closed, and the hymns had been sung, Ethan felt the same unease in his chest that he saw reflected in the dog's dark eyes. Something wasn't finished here. Something Harold Rowan had carried with him into the grave still lingered, rooted deep, waiting, patient as the oak itself. And as the mourners dispersed, the whispers did not fade. They followed the wind, clinging to the memory of the man and the shadow of his tree. The streets of Raven Hollow slept early. By 9 o'clock, the last neon glow at Ruby's diner had flickered out, and by 10, the only sounds left were the hum of crickets and the occasional creak of a porch swing swaying in the night breeze. For most, darkness brought silence and safety, but for Officer Ethan Ward, it was when the town truly revealed itself. He walked the gravel shoulder with the easy rhythm of routine, boots crunching against the stones, flashlight clipped to his vest. Beside him moved Shadow, his partner, his shield, his steady companion through years of long shifts. The German shepherd padded forward with quiet grace, the leash slack between them, his nose twitching at every subtle shift in the night air. Ethan sometimes thought of their partnership the way others thought of marriage, built on trust, trial, and unspoken language. He remembered the first day he had been paired with the pup, when Shadow was still half-clumsy legs and boundless energy, too eager to please and too quick to leap. Training had burned away the wild edges, but the loyalty, that had only deepened. Now, when Ethan moved, Shadow moved with him. When Ethan paused, the shepherd froze, muscles coiled, ears pricked. They were a pair cut from the same cloth, soldier and sentinel, bound by duty. The night air smelled of cut hay and distant rain, the kind that lingers at the edges of summer. Ethan let the silence stretch. He didn't mind it. After years of patrols together, silence had become their shared language, as comfortable as any conversation. But tonight, there was a weight in the stillness. When they turned onto North Road, the Rowan property came into view. Even in the dim glow of Ethan's flashlight, the oak loomed, taller than the neighboring roofs, its twisted branches a dark sprawl against the stars. Ethan's jaw tightened. He hadn't wanted this route, not tonight, not with the funeral still fresh. But duty was duty, and avoidance wasn't in his nature. Shadow slowed. His paws, usually certain, hesitated as they touched the gravel. His nose lifted, pulling at the air as though the breeze carried words only he could read. "Easy, boy," Ethan murmured, though his own stomach stirred. The shepherd's ears locked forward, tail stiffening until it hung like a rod. Then, with a sudden force, Shadow lunged. The leash snapped taut, burning against Ethan's palm. "Shadow," he hissed, bracing his boots in the gravel. The dog's body strained forward, muscles rippling, claws scraping furrows into the dirt. He wasn't after a stray cat or a raccoon. Ethan had seen that chase before. This was different. The shepherd's entire focus drilled into the base of the oak. Shadow's bark broke the silence. Deep, sharp, explosive. The kind of bark Ethan had learned to fear in raids and narcotics busts, when Shadow was seconds from signaling a find. The dog's chest heaved with another bark, and another, each one vibrating through Ethan's ribs like a drumbeat of warning. "Quiet," Ethan commanded, but his voice lacked conviction. His partner wasn't disobeying. He was insisting. Ethan crouched, shining his flashlight toward the roots. Nothing obvious, just tangled grass, soil dark from the storm a week earlier. Yet Shadow growled, nose pressed low, tail lowered but rigid, his body a wall of tension. The young officer's thoughts flickered uneasily back to the funeral. The whispers about Harold's obsession, the pastor's offhand words. "That tree gives me chills." And now, here was Shadow, trained to distinguish scents most men couldn't dream of, signaling as though the ground itself were alive with secrets. "Come on, boy." Ethan tugged the leash gently, but Shadow refused to move. He dug in harder, paws clawing at the dirt, his growl dropping into a low, guttural rumble that made the hair on Ethan's arms rise. The sound wasn't one of fear. It was challenge. Ethan swallowed, scanning the silent yard. The Rowan house stood dark, windows blind. A porch swing shifted slightly in the night air, squeaking with every sway. Beyond the fence, no neighbors stirred. The entire town seemed to be holding its breath. Shadow barked again, louder this time, sharp enough to rattle the glass panes of the nearest window. Lila's room, Ethan realized with a chill. A light flickered on upstairs. A curtain shifted. For the briefest second, the small face of a child pressed against the window. Lila's eyes were wide, luminous in the glow of her nightlight. Her lips moved, faintly carrying across the summer dark. Grandpa said, "Nobody can touch the oak." Ethan froze, pulse hammering. The words struck deeper than he expected, like a stone tossed into still water. He opened his mouth to answer, though he didn't know what he'd say. But before he could, the curtain fell shut. Shadow growled again, steady, unyielding. Ethan dragged a hand down his face. Logic told him to dismiss it. Dogs picked up scents all the time. Buried critters, old trash, damp roots. But instinct whispered otherwise. He had worked alongside Shadow too long not to recognize the dog's certainty. He crouched again, resting his palm against the shepherd's shoulder. The dog's muscles vibrated beneath his hand, tense as a bowstring. "Whatever it is," Ethan murmured, "you've got your teeth in it, don't you?" Shadow's only answer was another low growl, his eyes locked on the roots, as if daring the earth itself to yield. For a long moment, Ethan stayed there in the gravel, caught between reason and instinct, between silence and the sound of his partner's warning. The oak towered above them, branches whispering in the breeze, its shadow stretching long across the yard. And Ethan knew one thing with certainty. Whatever Harold Rowan had taken to his grave, Shadow hadn't let it rest. The Rowan house had always creaked at night. Its wooden frame, swollen from years of storms, groaned when the wind leaned against it, and the loose shutters tapped gently like knuckles on glass. For most, those sounds faded into background noise. But on this night, with the air thick and restless, they seemed sharper, like the house itself was listening. Inside, the faint glow of a lamp spilled across the kitchen table. Lila's mother, Claire Rowan, sat with a cup of tea cooling between her palms. Her shoulders slouched under the weight of too many days spent holding grief together for her daughter. She had the weary look of someone who carried both widowhood and single motherhood as quiet burdens, never letting the child see how heavy they really were. Lila padded in from the hallway, her rabbit dragging by one floppy ear. Her nightgown hung loose on her small frame, curls falling in a tumble over her face. She should have been asleep, but her eyes were wide and serious, in the way only children's could be, when something gnawed at their thoughts. "Mommy," she said softly, climbing onto a chair too big for her. Claire reached out, brushing hair back from her daughter's forehead. "You should be in bed, sweetheart. Tomorrow's a long day." But Lila shook her head. She looked around as though making sure the shadows weren't listening, then leaned closer. "Grandpa said the oak keeps something safe." The words landed with the quiet weight of confession. Claire blinked, caught between surprise and exasperation. "Honey, it's just a tree." She forced a smile, the kind adults wear when they hope to smooth away fear. "Your grandpa had his ways, but sometimes he made rules for no reason. You don't have to worry about that now." Lila's small fingers tightened around the rabbit. "It's not just a tree. He told me the oak was watching, that if anyone tried to hurt it, bad things would happen." Her mother froze, the steam from her cup curling in the silence. For an instant she saw Harold again, her father-in-law's lined face, his sharp eyes, the way his voice dropped when he spoke about that tree. She had never liked those moments. They had felt too heavy, too final, as though he was binding the family to something they couldn't escape. She sighed, shaking herself free of the memory. "Sweetheart, listen to me. Sometimes grown-ups say things that sound scary, but they're just stories. Your grandpa was stubborn, and he had his superstitions. That doesn't mean they're real." But Lila's eyes didn't waver. They glistened with something more than fear, something like certainty. Behind them, a floorboard creaked. Ethan Ward had been standing in the doorway, hat in hand. He had stopped by after patrol, a courtesy check on the family. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the tone in Lila's voice had rooted him in place. Now he cleared his throat softly. Claire turned, startled. "Officer Ward." "I didn't hear you come in. "Sorry," Ethan said, stepping into the lamplight. "Didn't mean to intrude." His gaze slid to Lila, who hugged her rabbit tighter under his attention. "I was just making sure you two were doing all right." Claire gave a tired smile. "We're fine. Just bedtime stories getting a little heavier than usual." Ethan's eyes flicked back to the child. "What kind of stories?" Before Claire could brush it off, Lila spoke again, her voice hushed but steady. "Grandpa said the oak was keeping something safe. He said we could never touch it." The room chilled. Ethan tried to keep his expression neutral, but his stomach twisted. He had heard those words before, at the graveside, whispered through the night when Shadow barked at the roots. And now, from the lips of a child too young to invent such a thing. Claire waved a hand, forcing lightness. "She's just remembering old things," he said. "You know how children are. They hold on to words, even when they don't make sense." But Ethan wasn't convinced. He studied the girl, the way she clutched the rabbit like a shield, the way her eyes darted toward the darkened window, as if the oak itself might be listening. Children sometimes remembered more than they understood. Sometimes their words carried the truth adults tried to bury. Shadow padded in from the back porch, nails clicking against the floorboards. His dark shape filled the doorway, eyes catching the lamplight. He moved to Lila's side without hesitation, settling beside her chair. His ears pricked, his gaze turning toward the window as though drawn by the same thought that had just passed her lips. The silence thickened. Ethan crouched, resting a hand on the dog's head. The fur beneath his palm was taut with tension, the muscles beneath vibrating faintly. Shadow wasn't resting. He was alert, watchful. Ethan knew that feeling too well, the calm before discovery. He rose slowly, tipping his hat. "Maybe it's just words," he said, his tone careful. "But sometimes words mean more than we think." Claire frowned. "Officer Ward, please." "My daughter's had enough to carry with her grandfather gone. I don't need old rules keeping her up at night." Ethan nodded, though the unease didn't leave his eyes. "I understand." He turned toward the door, his boots echoing softly against the worn floor. But as he stepped out into the night, Shadow lingered behind, nose pressed toward the window, ears pricked toward the tree outside. Ethan glanced back once more at the girl. Lila was whispering something into her rabbit's ear, words too soft to hear. But he didn't need to hear them. He already knew they carried the weight of secrets that refused to stay buried. And as the wind shifted, rattling the branches outside, Ethan felt it again, that unsettled stirring in his gut. Whatever the oak was keeping safe, it wasn't done speaking. The sky over Raven Hollow had a way of warning before storms arrived. Long before the first drop of rain touched the ground, the air would shift, growing heavy, metallic, the kind that clung to skin and made children restless. On this night, as dusk faded into a bruised purple horizon, the warning came in low rumbles rolling across the fields. Inside the Rowan house, Lila pressed her face against the cool glass of her bedroom window. She clutched her stuffed rabbit tight against her chest, its fabric worn thin from years of comfort. Outside, the trees swayed against the wind, their branches restless. But her eyes, wide and unblinking, stayed locked on one figure below. Shadow. The German shepherd sat on the patch of grass near the porch steps, not lying down, not pacing, just sitting. His silhouette cut sharp against the growing dark, ears pricked, chest still, eyes fixed on the oak at the far end of the yard. He didn't so much as flick an ear at the insects buzzing around him, or the thunder muttering overhead. Every ounce of him was turned toward the tree. Lila whispered softly into the rabbit's ear. "He's guarding it again." Her small voice barely carried, drowned beneath the distant rumble of thunder. But she said it anyway. Because to her, secrets felt safer when shared, even if only with a toy. A flash of lightning cracked across the horizon, throwing the oak into stark relief. For a brief moment, it looked less like a tree and more like a giant skeleton, its branches jagged bones, its trunk a spine twisting upward into the sky. The image sent a chill through her, and she hugged the rabbit tighter. Below, Shadow didn't move. His posture was statuesque, the stillness of a soldier at his post. Only his nose twitched now and then, testing the shifting wind. Lila's mother called from down the hall, her voice muffled by the storm shutters. "Lila, close your curtains." Time for bed. But the girl didn't move. She couldn't. Her gaze was glued to the yard, to the way the storm seemed to gather not across the whole town, but around that single tree. The oak swayed, its leaves shivering as though whispering to themselves. "Grandpa said the oak keeps something safe," she murmured again, repeating the words that had slipped out earlier in the kitchen. They felt heavier now, as if the storm itself was listening. A gust of wind rattled the shutters, making the house groan. Lila flinched, pressing her cheek against the glass. Down below, Shadow rose to his feet, hackles lifting. A low growl rolled from his chest, audible even through the window pane. It wasn't a sound of fear. It was warning. Lila's breath hitched. She tapped the glass lightly with her palm. "Shadow?" The dog's head lifted slightly at her voice, but his gaze didn't leave the oak. Another flash of lightning lit the yard, and for that instant, Lila thought she saw something shift at the base of the tree. Just a flicker, like the ground itself had stirred. She blinked, and it was gone. Only the thick roots remained, coiled like snakes gripping the earth. The thunder followed, louder now, closer. Rain began to tap at the roof in uneven splatters, the storm finally arriving. "Lila," her mother called again, firmer this time. "Curtains, now." With reluctance, she pulled the fabric closed. The world outside disappeared, replaced by the soft, dim glow of her nightlight. But even with the curtains drawn, she could still hear it. The storm pressing against the walls, the steady bark that suddenly broke through the rain. Shadow. She clutched her rabbit tighter, heart thudding in her small chest. He rarely barked at night, not unless something was wrong. Another bark followed, sharper, insistent. Then the sound of claws against the porch steps, pacing, restless. Lila slid from her bed, dragging the rabbit with her. She cracked the curtains open just enough to peek through. There he was, Shadow at the fence line, fur slick with rain, body angled toward the oak. His barks cut through the storm, fierce and unwavering. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the rain-soaked yard. The oak seemed to loom larger in that brief white blaze, its roots glistening as if something beneath the soil wanted out. Her throat tightened. For a moment, she thought of her grandfather's voice, low, stern, unyielding, repeating the rule, "No one touches the oak." And in the storm's howl, she almost believed she heard him again. Shadow barked once more, then stilled, nose pressed toward the ground, ears locked forward. He stood like that for several long seconds, the storm raging around him, before he let out a final growl and sat, guarding, waiting. Lila let the curtain fall shut, trembling. She crawled back into bed, pulling the rabbit beneath her chin. Her eyes fluttered closed, but the sound of the storm and the image of Shadow's unyielding watch burned behind her eyelids. She whispered into the darkness, almost too softly for herself to hear. "He's waiting for a secret." And outside, through rain and thunder, The shepherd kept his post, eyes fixed on the oak, as if daring it to speak. Morning light settled over Raven Hollow, with the same rhythm it always had. But in the weeks since Harold Rowan's funeral, the town's heartbeat felt off. The routines were still there. Men with mud-caked boots crowding the post office line, women carrying casseroles from one porch to another, the daily ringing of the bell above Ruby's diner door. But beneath all of it, something subtle and uneasy pulsed like a hidden current. At the diner, the clatter of plates and the hiss of bacon on the griddle should have carried the easy comfort of habit. But conversations now bent in one direction, slipping back again and again to the same subject: the Rowan property. Patty, the waitress with silver streaks in her hair, poured coffee into Sheriff Doyle's mug and leaned just close enough for her words to slide into his ear. "You know, folks are talking, Sheriff. They say Harold's rule about that oak wasn't just stubbornness. They say he knew something." Doyle grunted, adding cream to his coffee without meeting her eyes. "Folks say a lot of things when a man's on the ground." Still, Patty didn't move away. "Maybe. But I've lived here 50 years, and I've never once seen a dog act the way Shadow does around that tree. Not once." She straightened, her voice lowering. "Sometimes animals see clearer than people." Across the diner, old Mr. Jensen slammed down his fork. "Clearer or not, Harold was a lunatic about that tree. Chased me off his yard with a shotgun in '79, when all I wanted was a few branches for kindling. A man doesn't guard a tree like that unless he's hiding something." The booth across from him chimed in, a pair of farmhands in dusty overalls. "Or maybe he was protecting it. My daddy used to say the oak was older than the town, planted on bad ground. Said you cut into it, you'd bleed something you can't put back." Laughter barked from another table, but it was uneasy, like men whistling in a graveyard. Doyle sipped his coffee, jaw tight. He'd heard all of this before, but repetition didn't make it easier to ignore. The oak had become more than a tree. It was now a mirror reflecting back everyone's fears. At the post office, the story twisted again. Letters and parcels slid across counters while whispers slid across the room. "Did you hear? The dog barked half the night again," one woman murmured, as she tucked stamps into her purse. "My boy swears he saw lights moving out there by the oak." Another leaned close. "That family should just cut it down. Get rid of the thing before it brings more trouble." But her companion shook her head, clutching her envelope like a lifeline. "Don't say that. You remember what Lila said at the funeral. Grandpa told me no one can touch the oak. Child's words or not, it unsettled me." By midday, the gossip had stretched its roots as far as the oak itself. At the feed store, while sacks of grain thumped onto scales, voices carried. At the gas station, hands cupped cigarettes while men leaned against their trucks, muttering theories. Even at church on Sunday, Pastor Green couldn't stop his eyes from straying north toward the Rowan land as he preached about trust and faith. The oak had seeped into everything. Ethan Ward felt it most on patrol. The routine was supposed to be steady: check the storefront locks, drive the length of Main Street, circle out to the county road. But now, every route bent him back toward the Rowan property. It wasn't intentional, not at first, but the pull was there, like gravity, and Shadow never let him forget it. Each time they passed, the shepherd stiffened, tail dropping, body leaning forward against the leash. It was the same signal, over and over, night after night. Barking, pawing, growling at the roots, as if something beneath the earth was calling only to him. And though Ethan told himself it could be anything, wildlife, the scent of decay, even just the memory of Harold's presence, he couldn't shake the feeling that his partner knew better. The rest of the town might chatter and speculate, but Ethan carried the unease in silence. He recorded Shadow's behavior in his logbook with clinical detachment. K9 displayed heightened response at Rowan property, 11:46 p.m. But the notes didn't capture what it felt like, standing in the hush of night while a storm threatened overhead, hearing the dog's bark cut through the dark like a warning bell. He told himself it was routine. Just another entry. Yet the weight of it pressed harder each day. By the time the sun set, the whole town seemed to tilt toward the Rowan Oak, even when no one spoke of it aloud. Porch lights flickered on earlier, doors locked sooner, curtains drawn with a touch more haste. Parents called children in from yards before dusk fully settled, using chores as excuses, but casting glances toward the horizon where the tree loomed. Something was gathering. Everyone felt it, though no one dared name it. And when thunder finally cracked across the sky that evening, echoing through the valley like a gunshot, more than one person shivered, not because of the storm, but because in the pit of their stomachs they knew. The oak had always been waiting for a storm to come. The storm did not arrive quietly. All afternoon the air had thickened, swollen with the weight of something coming. The townsfolk of Raven Hollow knew storms the way farmers knew soil. They read them in the stillness, in the way the birds vanished from fence posts, in the way even the dogs grew restless. By evening, the sky had bruised into a heavy purple, and the first low growl of thunder rolled across the valley like a warning drum. At the Rowan property, the oak stood dark against the horizon, its branches thrashing as though they sensed what was on its way. Lila pressed her face to the living room window, Rabbit clutched tight against her chest. "It's coming," she whispered. Her mother, Claire, busied herself in the kitchen, pulling candles from drawers, trying to ignore the nervous energy crackling through the house. Shadow paced the porch outside, tail low, nose lifting with each gust of wind. Every so often he growled, not at the storm, but at the oak. Then the sky broke open. Lightning split the clouds in jagged white streaks, followed by a boom so loud it rattled dishes in their cabinets. Rain poured down in sheets, hammering the tin roof, overflowing gutters, turning the yard into a river of mud. The wind howled, ripping shingles from rooftops and tossing trash cans down Main Street. In the dark, the oak swayed, its massive branches whipping like arms in revolt. Leaves tore free and scattered across the yard, plastering themselves to windows and walls. The ground at its base, softened by weeks of summer storms, began to give way under the deluge. Water carved narrow runnels through the soil, pulling clumps of earth away and carrying them downhill. Inside the Rowan house, the lights flickered once, twice, then went black. Claire lit candles with shaking hands while Lila crouched under the table, eyes wide at the roar outside. "It's just a storm," her mother soothed, though her own voice trembled. But Shadow knew better. He had braced himself against the porch rail, claws dug into the wet boards, every muscle straining as he barked into the chaos. His voice was nearly drowned out by the wind, but he barked anyway, deep, sharp, commanding. Not at the thunder, not at the rain, at the tree. The storm raged for what felt like hours, but was only minutes, then began to ease. The rain slackened. The thunder retreated into the distance, leaving the air raw and heavy with the smell of wet earth. Power lines sagged, branches littered the roads, and the town of Raven Hollow exhaled in uneasy relief. By morning, the damage was plain. Shingles scattered like broken shells across lawns. The post office sign lay face down in the street. Fields glistened with puddles that mirrored the sky. And at the Rowan property, the oak bore scars of the storm. Its branches, though still strong, hung stripped in places, leaves plastered to its bark. At its base, where the storm water had carved the earth, the ground slumped away. Mud clung to its roots like exposed veins. And in that collapse of soil, something unnatural glistened. A strip of black plastic, thick and weathered, peeked through the dirt. Not large, no more than a hand's width, but stark against the brown mud, its edges crinkled and torn by time. It shimmered faintly under the weak sun, an intruder among roots and stone. Shadow found it first. At dawn, Ethan Ward pulled his cruiser into the drive to check on the family after the storm. He had barely stepped out when the shepherd darted past him, straight to the oak. The dog's body stiffened, ears flat, tail rigid. He lowered his head and pressed his nose to the exposed soil. Then the growl came, low, steady, vibrating deep in his chest. Ethan frowned, boots squelching in the mud as he approached. "What is it, boy?" Shadow barked once, sharp and explosive, then began pawing furiously at the dirt, claws tearing into the softened ground. Mud flew in sprays as he dug, his movements frantic, driven. "Shadow, enough," Ethan snapped, grabbing at his harness, pulling him back. But the shepherd twisted against him, body rigid, eyes locked on the black strip jutting from the soil. His growl deepened, rolling like distant thunder. "What's that?" A small voice chirped. Ethan turned to see Lila standing barefoot on the porch, hair tangled from sleep, rabbit dangling from her hand. She pointed at the plastic shimmering in the light. Before her fingers could reach, Shadow lunged, planting himself between the child and the tree. His bark tore through the morning air, teeth bared, body quivering with tension. Lila jumped back, startled, her lip trembling. "He scared me," she whispered. Ethan crouched, hand firm on the dog's collar, though his own heart was hammering. He knew this reaction. He had seen it in drug busts, when Shadow signaled narcotics hidden in walls. He had seen it on search calls, when the dog locked onto human scent beneath rubble. He had never once seen it false. His eyes drifted back to the oak, to the black strip peeking from the roots. Mud clung to it, but the edges were too sharp, too deliberate to be nature. Shadow barked again, insistent, his body a wall between the secret in the earth and the little girl standing nearby. Ethan's stomach twisted. Whatever was buried there, it wasn't just trash. The storm had left more than broken branches in its wake. It had peeled back the skin of the earth itself, and the oak had begun to give up its secret. The morning after the storm, Raven Hollow smelled of wet earth and electricity, the kind of scent that lingered after lightning had clawed through the sky. Roads were slick with mud, yards littered with broken branches, and the air carried the uneasy quiet of a town still shaken. Ethan Ward pulled his cruiser into the Rowan driveway, gravel crunching beneath the tires. He told himself it was routine, checking in after a storm, making sure Claire and Lila were all right. But beneath that excuse was something else, something heavier. Shadow's growls from the night before still pressed against his memory like a bruise that wouldn't fade. The shepherd leapt out before Ethan had even shut the door. His paws splashed through puddles as he bolted across the yard, nose locked forward, tail stiff with purpose. Ethan followed, his boots sinking into the softened ground, eyes drawn toward the oak. The storm had scarred the tree. Branches lay scattered like bones, leaves clung wet and heavy to the trunk, and at its base the soil had slumped, exposing the black glimmer of plastic that caught the morning light. Shadow reached it first. His bark exploded into the quiet yard, deep, sharp, furious. He lunged at the exposed strip, claws tearing into the mud, his growl rolling low and dangerous. Every line of his body radiated urgency, as if he'd finally found what he had been warning about all along. "Shadow!" Ethan called, quickening his pace. From the porch, the screen door banged open. Lila darted out barefoot, her rabbit dangling from one small hand. Her hair was still tangled from sleep, her nightgown flapping in the breeze as she ran across the damp grass. "Officer Ethan," she called brightly. Then her eyes fell on the oak. "What's that?" She pointed at the black plastic. Her small legs carried her faster than Ethan expected, straight toward the tree. "Lila, stop!" he barked, but his warning was too late. Shadow surged forward, planting himself between the child and the roots. His bark turned savage, chest heaving, saliva spraying with each explosive cry. His teeth bared, eyes blazing, not at the girl, but at the thing in the ground. He thrust his body forward, blocking her with the ferocity of a soldier holding the line. Lila froze mid-step, her eyes wide. She stumbled back, lip trembling. He scared me," she whispered, clutching her rabbit tight against her chest. Ethan reached them, crouching quickly. He grabbed Shadow's harness, feeling the dog's muscles vibrate under his hand, rigid as steel. The growl that poured from the shepherd's chest wasn't confusion, wasn't play. It was the unmistakable certainty of a trained signal. Ethan had felt it in drug raids when Shadow had locked onto hidden caches of narcotics. He had seen it on search calls when the dog had found scent trails others missed. And every time, Shadow had been right. Ethan's gut twisted, a cold knot forming deep inside him. He shone his flashlight down at the soil, though the morning light was enough. The strip of plastic jutted just far enough to catch the sun, its edges folded and weathered. Not trash blown in by the wind. Not bark peeled away by storm. Something else. Something buried. Shadow snarled again, pawing at the dirt, sending clumps of mud flying. His tail slashed low, body rigid, every breath vibrating with determination. Ethan pulled him back, though the dog fought the restraint, straining against the harness. He glanced at Lila, who stood just behind him, her small chest rising and falling in frightened bursts. He softened his voice. "It's all right, kiddo. He's not mad at you. He's protecting you." She blinked up at him, eyes glistening. "From what?" Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. From the porch, Claire called out, her voice edged with alarm. "Lila, get away from that tree!" The girl hesitated, then scurried back across the wet grass, clutching her rabbit tight. Claire met her halfway, scooping her into her arms, casting a wary glance toward Ethan and the dog still locked at the base of the oak. "What is it?" she asked, though her tone suggested she didn't want to know. Ethan shook his head. Not sure yet. But the words felt hollow, a shield against what his instincts already screamed. Shadow barked again, sharp and punishing, the sound carrying across the yard, bouncing off the wet fences and lingering in the heavy air. Ethan recognized the tone. It was the same bark that had once signaled hidden heroin inside a sealed shipping container. The same bark that had led them to a missing boy, unconscious but alive, buried under collapsed drywall. It was a bark that meant evidence. And here, in this quiet yard, under the watch of a storm-battered oak, it meant something buried that should not have been. Ethan's throat tightened. He crouched again, resting a hand on Shadow's back, steadying him, grounding himself in the same motion. The dog's body quivered beneath his palm, not from fear, but from the raw force of instinct and training colliding. "Easy, boy," Ethan whispered, though his own heart hammered. Shadow's eyes never left the plastic. His growl rolled again, deeper this time, almost mournful in its persistence. Ethan looked back at Claire, who stood stiff with her daughter clinging to her hip. He thought of Harold's iron rule, repeated through decades. No one touches the oak. He thought of the funeral whispers, of children too afraid to climb its branches, of Lila's own words. Grandpa said the oak keeps something safe. And now, here was Shadow, proving with every bark that Harold hadn't been guarding nothing. Ethan straightened slowly, tugging the leash until the shepherd eased back by inches, though his growl never ceased. His eyes lingered on the soil, on the sliver of plastic gleaming wet in the morning sun. He had seen this scene too many times before. Not here, not under this tree, but in alleys, in basements, in dark corners where secrets festered. He recognized the signs, the tension, the certainty in his partner's body, and the realization pressed like iron against his chest. Whatever was buried beneath the oak, it was not meant to stay hidden forever. Ethan Ward sat behind the wheel of his cruiser, longer than he meant to, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly the leather creaked. Shadow panted in the back, still restless from the morning's discovery. Every so often, the shepherd let out a low rumble, eyes locked on the smear of mud clinging to Ethan's boots. It wasn't the mud that unsettled Ethan. It was what had been buried under it. The thin black strip of plastic gleaming in the roots of the old oak. Shadow had locked onto it with a violent certainty. In years of service, the dog had never given a false signal. And yet, Ethan hesitated, radio mic in hand, weighing instinct against the authority that loomed over him. Finally, he called it in. Minutes later, Sheriff Doyle's cruiser pulled up, his weathered face unreadable as always. He listened, half amused, as Ethan pointed to the plastic. "Trash," Doyle said flatly, after brushing the soil. Harold Rowan was a pack rat, probably buried junk. "Shadow doesn't have a false alarm," Ethan snapped. "And I don't chase ghosts," Doyle replied, eyes narrowing. "Write it in your log if you want, but don't stir up this town over a dog's bark." The sheriff's words stung, but they didn't loosen Ethan's gut. Doyle drove away, leaving only silence, and Shadow, tense and unyielding, eyes drilling into the roots as if he could see through the earth. Ruby's diner was Raven Hollow's heart, carrying gossip the way the post office carried bills. That afternoon, Ethan pushed through the door, Shadow at his side. Conversations hushed, then rose again. Corn yields, teenagers laughing too loudly, and inevitably, talk of the oak. Harold was touched in the head about that tree, old Jensen muttered over his mug. Guarded it like gold. Not gold, another man said darkly. He was hiding something. The room chuckled nervously. In Raven Hollow, laughter disguised fear. Patty the waitress leaned close as she poured Ethan's coffee. "My daddy worked Harold's land once. Stacked wood too near the oak. Harold came out with a shotgun and said if he touched that tree again, he'd regret it." Ethan's grip tightened on the mug. "He never told anyone?" "Just me," Patty said. "Said a man doesn't guard bark and branches. He guards a secret." The words settled heavier than steam. Across the room, someone mentioned a farmhand gone missing years ago, last seen near the Rowan fence line. Silence followed, thick enough to choke on. Ethan didn't join in. He didn't need to. The voices filled in the picture his gut already painted. Harold's fury, the disappearances, Shadow's violent certainty. Gossip, yes, but gossip with teeth. Patty refilled his cup and asked quietly, "Have you ever seen your dog act like that before?" "No," Ethan said, eyes on Shadow. The shepherd lay still, but his ears twitched with every gust of wind drifting through the window, nose pointed north toward the tree. Patty nodded. "Then I'd trust him more than half the men in this town." The bell over the door chimed. Sheriff Doyle stepped in, his presence cooling the chatter to a hush. He sipped his coffee like nothing weighed on him, but Ethan wondered if even Doyle felt the town's unease pressing heavier by the day. Shadow lifted his head, gaze sharp on the sheriff, and Ethan's hand slid along the dog's back, grounding them both. That night, the Rowan house creaked in the settling air. Claire tucked her daughter into bed, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "Sleep, sweetheart." But Lila's eyes stayed wide, drawn to the oak looming black against the moonlight. When the door clicked shut, Lila clutched her stuffed rabbit and listened to the night. Crickets, dripping eaves, and memories she wished she could forget. She remembered creeping downstairs in pajamas, hiding behind the porch railing while men's shadows stretched long across the walls. Their voices clashed with her grandfather Harold's roar. "No one touches that tree," he thundered. "Not you. Not anyone." Sometimes fists slammed the railing. Sometimes men spat curses. But always Harold stood firm, shotgun close, Shadow bristling at his side. Young then, his growl steady, eyes fixed on the oak like he guarded more than wood. Lila's fingers had gripped the railing until her knuckles whitened. She never understood the fights, only the fear in Harold's voice, the desperation in his command. And one night, she had heard a man snarl, "You think you can keep it buried forever?" Buried. She hadn't understood then. But lying in bed now with shadows circling outside, the word echoed sharp and clear. Buried. She pressed her palms over her ears, whispering into the dark. "It's true. Something's there. Grandpa knew. Shadow knows." Outside, the shepherd barked once, low and steady, as though agreeing. In the hallway, Ethan paused, hearing the faint whisper through the door. He caught no words, only the fragile edge in her tone. A silence carrying the weight of things deeper than childhood fear. He exhaled, uneasy. Too often, he'd leaned on Doyle's authority, telling himself instinct wasn't enough. But between the certainty of a child and the unyielding gaze of a dog, denial felt thinner than paper. Lila clutched her rabbit tight, memories sharpening. Porch lights, men's threats, Harold's fury, Shadow's growl. They weren't fading. They were warnings. And for the first time, she dared to think it. Maybe the oak wasn't just a tree her grandfather guarded. Maybe it was a secret so dark it had poisoned him. And now, it threatened her too. The decision came on a Tuesday morning, quiet on the surface, but trembling with fear underneath. Claire Rowan had paced the kitchen half the night, her daughter's words echoing. "Grandpa said the oak keeps something safe." She wanted to believe the sheriff's dismissal, but Shadow's furious barking in the storm and the whispers in town gnawed at her. She told herself her choice was practical. The oak leaned too close to the house, its roots twisting like fists in the soil. Another storm, and it might crash through the roof. But truth sat deeper. She wanted the tree gone, its shadow, its whispers, the grip Harold's rules still held even after death. By noon, a battered pickup arrived with chainsaws, ropes, and 2 men in hard hats. "Big one," one muttered, eyeing the oak. "Client's orders," said the other. "We'll notch it, bring it down clean." Neighbors gathered quickly. No secret ever stayed long in Raven Hollow. Patty, from Ruby's diner, wiped flour from her hands, apron still on. Old Mr. Jensen leaned on his cane, muttering, "About time someone cut the damn thing." But Mrs. Ellison clutched her rosary, whispering prayers. "It won't end anything," she murmured. "It'll stir more trouble." Inside, Lila clung to her mother's skirt, sobbing. "No, Mommy. Grandpa said bad things will happen if we touch it." Claire tried to soothe her. "It's just a tree, sweetheart. I need to keep you safe." But Lila's plea cut sharp. "He made me promise." Claire, worn thin by grief and responsibility, whispered back, "I'm your mother. I decide what keeps us safe." Outside, a chainsaw roared. The street stiffened, and shadow exploded from the porch. The shepherd hurled himself between worker and oak, body braced, bark erupting like a gunshot. The man stumbled, dropping the saw into mud. Lila screamed from the porch, "Stop! Grandpa said no!" The cutters froze, unnerved. They'd felled plenty of trees, but never faced a canine with eyes burning like judgment itself. Ethan was already running, yanking open his cruiser door. He seized Shadow's harness, but the dog strained like living steel, gaze fixed on the roots, where storm water had exposed a black glimmer. "This isn't confusion," Ethan muttered. "This is a signal." The second worker killed his saw, shaking his head. "We're not getting in the middle of this." The crowd's whispers swelled. "He's protecting something." "Dogs don't act like that for nothing." Patty's voice rose above them. "Harold was right. That tree's got something in it." Claire flushed with anger, but fear bled through. She hugged Lila close, her own eyes drawn helplessly to the oak. Then the saw screamed again, one man trying to force bravado. Shadow lunged. His growl was primal, a war cry dredged from some ancient pact with humankind. He planted himself between steel and bark, hackles high, chest forward. The cutter recoiled, silencing the saw with a curse. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Ellison's rosary clicked faster. "I'm not cutting with that dog here," the second man stammered. From the porch, Lila's cry broke through everything. "He's my hero!" Silence followed, heavy as stone. Jensen, who had laughed at Harold's nonsense for decades, stared at the shepherd without a word. Ethan skidded into the mud, gripping Shadow's harness, grounding the thunder vibrating in the dog's body. "Easy, boy. I see it too." The workers retreated toward their truck. The crowd leaned in, held by a thread woven of fear and belief. Patty whispered, "Maybe it wasn't whiskey that kept Harold watching. Maybe it was the tree." Claire clutched her daughter, pale and shaken. For the first time, her voice trembled not with anger, but with recognition. "Officer Ward, what is happening to him?" Ethan didn't soften. "He believes there's danger." Jensen's cane tapped the fence. "Or proof." A hush settled. The cutters lowered their gear. Claire swallowed hard, then looked at Ethan. "If you tell me to stop, I'll stop." Ethan stared at the roots, at the strip of black plastic peeking from the soil. His gut clenched with a certainty, honed by years of calls that began in whispers and ended in blood. "You've seen this before," it told him. "Just not here." "Stop," he said. "Nobody cuts." Relief and dread rippled through the crowd. Claire sagged. Lila whispered, "Thank you," though no one knew whether she meant Ethan, the dog, or the tree itself. Shadow shifted just enough to heal, but his stare never left the oak. He was still a barricade, still a beacon. If the ground tried to hide its secret again, he would be the last thing standing in its way. Then came the siren, winding down Main, sliding toward the Rowan place like fate. Sheriff Doyle's cruiser pulled in slow, engine growling. He stepped out, stone-faced, scanning the crowd, the cutters, the dog, braced against the tree. "All right," he said. "Somebody tell me what's going on." The workers spoke first, flustered. "We were hired to cut, but the dog, he won't let us near." The crowd erupted. "He's protecting something. Harold's tree." "Told you there was more to it." Claire's voice cut sharp, brittle. "I just wanted it gone, for safety." But even she sounded unconvinced. Doyle turned to Ethan. "Ward?" Ethan's grip tightened on Shadow's harness. "The storm exposed something. Shadow's signaling is hard. This isn't random." The sheriff's jaw clenched. "We've talked about this. You can't hang a case on a dog's bark and a scrap of plastic." Mrs. Ellison spoke up, voice trembling but strong. "Harold Rowan guarded that tree with a shotgun his whole life." "You think it was for nothing?" Patty added. "My daddy said Harold threatened him once for stacking wood too close. That wasn't about bark." Murmurs swelled. Jensen jabbed his cane. "You've got half the town watching, Doyle. You're going to tell us it's all in our heads?" Then Shadow barked, one sharp, punishing crack that silenced everything. All eyes swung to Doyle. He inhaled, exhaled, jaw grinding. Finally he said, "Shut it down. Nobody touches that tree." The words dropped like a gavel. The cutters stowed their saws. The crowd buzzed with a mix of prayers and speculation. Lila whispered into her mother's dress, "See, Mommy. Shadow saved us." Ethan felt his chest loosen. Shadow eased slightly, though his eyes stayed locked on the roots. Doyle stepped closer, voice low. "This isn't superstition anymore. We open an investigation. Until then, that oak stands." The crowd erupted again, but no one challenged him. For Ethan, the moment marked a line crossed. The oak was no longer just Harold's stubborn legacy. It was evidence. And evidence never stayed buried for long. Shadow gave one last growl, steady and certain, sealing what everyone now understood. The oak held a secret Raven Hollow could no longer ignore. The next morning broke with the heavy stillness of a courtroom before the gavel falls. Sheriff Marcus Doyle returned to the Rowan property with 2 deputies, their shovels slung like rifles. Cruisers lined the drive, lights spinning without sirens. Raven Hollow's neighbors gathered again, drawn as much by dread as curiosity. Women in aprons clutched coffee mugs at fence posts. Men muttered about Harold, curses, storms. No one looked too long at the oak. On the porch, Claire held Lila tight. The child's eyes were red from a night of tears, her stuffed rabbit crushed against her chest. She stared at the tree with a solemn focus no 5-year-old should wear. At the roots, Ethan Ward stood with Shadow pressed to his leg, leash wound tight in his fist. The shepherd's ears pitched forward, nose quivering, muscles taut with a certainty Ethan knew too well. The dog had locked onto the truth and would not let go. Doyle adjusted his hat, his voice carrying. "By the book. If there's nothing here, we move on. If there is..." He let the words hang. Ethan crouched beside his partner. "Show me, boy." He unhooked the leash. Shadow circled the oak in tightening arcs, nose to earth, then stopped where the storm had peeled back soil. He barked once, sharp, and began to dig. Dirt sprayed behind him. The younger deputy swallowed. "Looks like he picked the spot." Doyle's jaw flexed, but he nodded. "Start there." Metal struck ground. Each scoop landed with a wet thud,
the sound of a secret being forced into daylight. Shadow paced at the edge, barking whenever the rhythm faltered, nosing the men back into line.
"He's herding us," the older deputy muttered. "He knows," Ethan answered quietly. The smell of damp earth thickened. Sweat beaded foreheads. The fence line whispers grew. "It's true." Harold kept something here. Claire clutched Lila tighter. The girl whispered into her rabbit's ear. "He's telling us the secret." Then came a hollow thunk. The older deputy froze, hand brushing soil. "Not a root," he said. Shadow's growl deepened, claws raking harder. "Hold," Doyle ordered. "Gloves, bags, nobody bare-handed." Silence pressed in, broken only by the scrape of shovels and Shadow's steady rumble. Ethan laid a hand on the shepherd's back, feeling the tremors of anticipation. This wasn't superstition. He'd seen this stance too many times. In barns, in trunks, in places where men tried to bury sins. The older deputy brushed again. Wood fragments surfaced, splintered but worked by human hands. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "A box," the man muttered. "Or what's left of one." Murmurs rose. "A coffin. Lord help us." Lila whimpered. "That's what Grandpa was keeping safe." Ethan's chest tightened. He knew the earth here hadn't settled right. He knew what Shadow was telling him. "You're close. Don't stop." The deputies dug slower now, scraping with gloved hands until the oak itself yawned open, hollow inside like a vault. Shadow snarled, pressing his nose against the gap, barking again, his signal clear as a command. "I hear you," Ethan murmured. The older deputy leaned deeper, gloves snagging something slick. He pulled, and the earth gave way. A strip of black plastic peeled free like a wound opening. The smell hit at once, sour, unmistakable, decay. The younger deputy gagged, stumbling back. "Christ!" Gasps and cries rippled from the fence. Mrs. Ellison clutched her rosary. Patty pressed a towel to her face. On the porch, Lila screamed, burying her face in her mother's dress. Shadow barked furiously, planting himself as if his body alone could hold back the horror seeping from the ground. Ethan's grip on the harness tightened, his own stomach twisting. "Hold it together," Doyle barked, though his face had gone pale. "Evidence only. Nobody digs further without bags." The deputy pulled again. The bag sagged free, heavy, its outline damning before it was even opened. Rotted cloth slipped from the torn plastic. The stench deepened. "That's human," the younger deputy whispered, his voice cracking. No one argued. The crowd broke into frantic whispers. "Murder. Missing men. Harold's secret." Lila sobbed harder, crying into her mother's dress. "I told you. Grandpa said no one could touch it." Claire's tears streamed silently. The bag thudded to the ground. Another foul breath curled across the yard. The neighbors recoiled, faces white with horror. Doyle stepped forward, his authority stripped of denial. His voice was iron and grave. "This is a crime scene." The words hit like a gavel. Deputies moved shakily, stringing yellow tape. Neighbors stepped back, but didn't leave. They had been pulled here by gossip. Now they were chained by fear. On the porch, Lila whispered through her sobs, "Shadow saved us. He saved us from Grandpa's secret." Ethan closed his eyes, the weight of her words sinking deep. When he opened them, Shadow still stared into the hollow, growling, fading, but eyes unyielding. The oak no longer looked like just a tree. It was a monument to something Harold Rowan had guarded with his life. And now, thanks to a storm, a child's memory, and a dog's refusal to stop, Raven Hollow's darkest secret had been dragged into the light. Morning fog clung to Raven Hollow like a shroud when the forensic vans rolled onto the Rowan property.
Their tires crunched the damp gravel, lights spinning without sirens, painting yellow tape and muddy footprints in flashes of red and blue. The town held its breath. Ethan stood near the oak, shadow pressed against his leg. The shepherd's gaze never strayed from the hollow, his posture rigid, his growl a low undercurrent in the heavy air. The team moved with quiet precision. Mara, the lead technician, snapped on gloves and knelt by the cavity. Her assistant steadied the bag as she lifted it free of the soil, its black plastic sagging with unmistakable weight. Even before it opened, the gravity of what it held pressed against the yard like a storm front. Plastic crackled. A sour stench rolled out, pungent and undeniable. Inside, rotted cloth clinging to pale bones. A skull tilted sideways, teeth bared in a grim echo of life. A hand curled stiffly, fingers clawed as though clutching secrets to the end. Gasps rippled from the crowd beyond the tape. Parents clutched their children. Teenagers froze mid-whisper. Claire gripped Lila, who started unblinking, her rabbit crushed in her arms. Ethan's hand tightened on Shadow's harness. He had seen bodies before, in raids, in crashes, but never like this, never so intimate, never buried in the soil of his own town. Mara's voice was steady, clinical. FEMA intact, trauma here. Clothing suggests long deposition. Each observation cut through the hush like a gavel. Her assistant brushed soil gently from the remains, methodical, respectful. Death was being catalogued piece by fragile piece. Shadow growled, low and resonant, but he didn't lunge. He understood. His muzzle twitched, nostrils flaring, ears pinned forward. He had been there when the whispers began, when the storm broke the soil, when the first shred of plastic gleamed, and now he stood as witness to the truth. Ethan knelt beside him. "Good boy," he whispered. "We'll see this through." Shadow's eyes flicked to his, dark and unwavering. The oak loomed above, its branches stirring faintly. For a moment, sunlight pierced the fog, falling on bark slick with rain, giving it the look of confession. The town could no longer pretend Harold Rowan's obsession had been mere eccentricity. The earth had spoken. By mid-morning, the news had spread like wildfire. Ruby's diner buzzed with voices sharper than the clink of forks. Patty, pale and trembling, refilled mugs with shaking hands. "It's true," she whispered. "Bones under the oak." Conversation spiraled. "Murder," one man said. Another shook his head. "Maybe he was protecting us from something worse." The clash of fear and speculation turned every booth into a jury box. At the feed store, Mr. Ellison leaned on a broom, his voice dry. "My boy used to play under that tree." Customers clustered in aisles, trading theories, murder, sacrifice, protection. Accusations flared, then softened into nervous silences. Even the church could not contain the unease. Reverend Callahan tried for calm. "We mustn't judge without proof." A woman's voice trembled back. "But Reverend, bones in a bag. How can we not be afraid?" The square filled with knots of neighbors, whispering in clipped bursts. Some remembered Harold's midnight threats. Others recalled strange shadows, odd noises, men who vanished. Every memory now bent to fit the puzzle. Ethan moved through town quietly, Shadow at his side. The dog's ears flicked at every shout, every gasp. Children stared at him with wide eyes as though he were more sentinel than dog now, the one who had forced the truth into daylight. In the diner, arguments grew louder. "He killed them," one farmer roared. "Harold's a murderer," a woman countered, voice shaking. "No, he was protecting us. He buried something worse." The room crackled with fear and conviction. Sheriff Doyle sat in his office, phone ringing non-stop, neighbors demanding clarity. His face was carved with strain. He had once dismissed the oak as superstition. Now his authority strained beneath the weight of a community split between outrage and terror. By noon, the fog lifted, but the town only darkened. Gossip no longer felt like idle talk. It was fuel, catching fast, threatening to burn out of control. Back at the property, Ethan paused by the oak. Its bark glistened like old scars, its hollow now a gaping wound. The soil was damp, the scent of decay still hanging. Shadow sat sentinel, ears sharp, body tense, eyes drilling into the cavity as if it still held more than had been revealed. Ethan crouched, hand resting on taut muscle. "There's more here, isn't there?" he whispered. Shadow's growl rumbled in answer, soft but certain. The dog sniffed, circled, pawed at a cluster of rocks, half buried in mud. Ethan brushed the soil, fingers meeting something hard and deliberate beneath. He exhaled slowly. "You're guiding us, boy. And I trust you." Shadow's tail flicked once, acknowledgement enough. His eyes never left the tree. The oak stood at the center of a field, bowed with rain-heavy grass, roots coiled like veins through the town's history. It had guarded its secret for decades, but the storm, the child's memory, and a dog's refusal to yield had forced the first truth into the open. And Ethan knew this was only the beginning. The sheriff's office smelled of aged paper and burnt coffee, a scent that should have been comforting, but now pressed like a weight over the room. Ethan sat across from Marcus Doyle at a worn oak table, file folders fanned out like a landscape of unfinished stories. Shadow lay at Ethan's feet, head resting on paws, ears flicking at every creak. Doyle leaned back, fingers steepled. "Most of these are years old," he said, voice cautious. "Drifters, farmhands, travelers who wandered too far."
Raven Hollow's always had the occasional disappearance. Ethan opened one of the folders, the pages soft from years of handling. A 19-year-old farmhand, last seen walking home in a snowstorm. Another file, a child gone missing after dusk. Another, a drifter who never made it past the Rowan fence line. In isolation, they were tragedies. Together, they were a pattern. "These cases cluster," Ethan murmured. "Near the Rowan property, around the oak, always late fall, early winter, always before storms. Someone was watching the land, waiting." Shadow shifted, pressing his muzzle against Ethan's boot as though confirming the thought. Doyle rubbed his jaw, eyes narrowing at the files. "So, Harold wasn't just eccentric about that tree. He might not have been acting alone." Ethan slid another folder across the desk. The photographs inside, faded and grainy, stared back with wide, unknowing eyes. Every one of them is tied to the land in some way. And the dates, they're too deliberate to ignore. The fluorescent lights flickered, throwing shadows across the sheriff's face. Doyle's shoulders sagged. "For years we called it gossip, Harold's temper, his shotgun threats. We dismissed it all." He exhaled, voice low. "And all along, maybe the oak wasn't superstition. Maybe it was a graveyard." Silence thickened. Shadow raised his head, ears pricked, growling softly, not at the sheriff, but at the unspoken truth filling the room. Ethan leaned forward. "It's evidence now. If we ignore this, someone else could vanish." The sheriff's eyes hardened, though guilt flickered in them. This could unravel everything. Panic, hysteria. Once the past is exposed, there's no going back. "Then we don't flinch," Ethan said. "We cross-reference. Old deeds, weather logs, family records. Build the picture piece by piece. And we let Shadow guide us. He's never wrong." For a moment, Doyle looked at the shepherd. Shadow's gaze was steady, unwavering, as if daring the sheriff to dismiss him again. Doyle straightened slowly, resolve forming in the lines of his face. "All right," he said. "We start with the records." But quietly. Shadow rose, tail stiff, padding toward the door, nostrils flaring at the faint creak of hinges. Ethan watched him, his chest tightening with the familiar edge of anticipation. They weren't just investigators now. They were participants in the slow unraveling of Raven Hollow's darkest history. By late afternoon, the town simmered under muted amber light. The sheriff's office grew quiet, but the silence carried unease. Doyle sat at his desk, shoulders slumped, flipping through another faded file. His fingers trembled slightly on the photograph of a young man who had vanished decades earlier. "I thought I was protecting people," Doyle admitted, voice raw, dismissing rumors, calling it paranoia. "But I ignored what I didn't want to see." And that dog knew before any of us. Ethan crouched to meet his gaze. Shadow lifted his head, eyes sharp, and let out a deliberate growl that seemed to echo Doyle's confession. "Shadow doesn't guess," Ethan said quietly. "He acts when we hesitate. He's brought us here for a reason." Doyle shut the folder, his jaw set. "Then we start listening to him. Every time. No more excuses." Shadow shifted closer, pressing his nose against the edge of the desk. The sheriff met his eyes and, for the first time in days, squared his shoulders. "We have work to do," he said. "Maps, dates, patterns, and no shortcuts." Ethan nodded. A sense of clarity cut through the haze. The past was heavy, but the present demanded courage. That night, the farmhouse was quiet, lit only by the glow of a lantern swaying gently on the kitchen table. Outside, the oak loomed in moonlight, its twisted branches casting long shadows across the field. Upstairs, Lila lay curled beneath a thin blanket, her stuffed rabbit clutched tight. Her eyes glistened in the half-darkness, too wide, too old for a child her age. At the foot of the bed, Shadow rested, his form massive and steady, a living fortress. His ears twitched at every creak, every sigh of wind through the rafters. Tentatively, Lila stretched out a hand, her fingers brushing the coarse fur of his neck. "You saved us," she whispered, her voice fragile. "From Grandpa's secret." Shadow nudged her hand gently, amber eyes soft, yet unyielding. She smiled faintly, a flicker of innocence piercing the fear. "You're brave, Shadow. I don't know what we'd do without you." His tail thumped once, a quiet affirmation. The wind rattled the windows. Lila flinched, but Shadow pressed closer, warmth and weight grounding her. Her voice trembled, but carried conviction. "I trust you. Always." Shadow curled nearer, his body forming a shield between the girl and the world outside. His eyes stayed open, scanning the room, vigilant even as her breathing slowed into sleep. Ethan sat in the doorway, lantern glow flickering across his weary face. He had seen Shadow in raids and searches, fierce and relentless. But here, watching him guard a child's sleep, he understood the dog's truest strength. Lila's faith in him was absolute, distilled into its purest form. Outside, the oak shivered in the moonlight, its bark dark with rain, its hollow now a wound the town could no longer ignore. Inside, in a child's whispered trust and a dog's unyielding watch, a sanctuary flickered into being, a fragile light against the weight of Raven Hollow's secrets. Ethan's chest tightened with both awe and resolve. Shadow had uncovered the past. Now, it was their duty to see the truth carried forward, to protect the living, honor the dead, and confront whatever else the oak still held. And as the night deepened, Raven Hollow seemed to hold its breath once more, waiting for the storm that would surely follow. The morning light hung heavy over Raven Hollow, pressing through clouds as if reluctant to wake the town. Ethan Ward drove slowly beside Sheriff Doyle, the cruiser rattling along the dirt road toward the Talbot farmhouse. Behind them, Shadow's dark eyes never left the oak tree that loomed in the distance, a black crown against the grey horizon. Martha Talbot opened her door before Ethan could knock, her face pale, urgent. "You're here about Harold, aren't you? I've said it for years. He was hiding things this town didn't want to see." Her husband George shuffled forward, gaze fixed on the oak. "Don't call him a murderer. Careful. Yes, too careful. But Harold wasn't the kind to take life. He warned us. Said there were men, dangerous men, who'd ruin anyone who crossed them." His eyes darted toward Doyle, pleading. Maybe what he buried wasn't guilt. Maybe it was protection. Ethan scribbled notes, heart tightening. Harold's legacy was splintering, half whispers of temper, half hints of guardianship. Either way, the oak was no longer just a tree. It was a wound. By midday, Ethan and Doyle had spoken to half the hollow. Families on porches, neighbors leaning over fences, farmers at the feed store. Each voice deepened the divide. Some painted Harold as a paranoid tyrant, shouting at drifters in the night. Others remembered him steering children from dangerous paths, shotgun across his lap, as if shielding the town from threats no one dared name. A woman outside the general store shook her head. "That tree saw more than you know. Some things are better buried." Her words, half warning, half confession, clung to Ethan's notebook like ash. At the diner, Patty wiped her hands on her apron, whispering to anyone who'd listen. Obsession doesn't make a man a killer. Maybe Harold was protecting something bigger than himself. Faces around her wavered between relief and dread. Even children had stopped playing freely. They hovered close to porches, eyes wide, listening to the adults' quarrels. The oak, once a backdrop, had become a presence, looming, watching, demanding judgment. The confrontation came at the hardware store. Ethan pushed through the door, Shadow at his side. The air was thick with sawdust and suspicion. A crowd had gathered in the aisles, voices sharp as hammers striking metal. "Harold protected us," a man shouted, wrench raised like a gavel. "He kept worse things from happening." A woman slammed her fist on the counter. "Protected? You saw the bones. He was a monster, and you know it." Accusations tangled like barbed wire. Fear curdled into anger. Shadow lowered his stance, ears pitched forward, his presence pulling the heat from the room without a sound. One by one, eyes turned toward the dog as though waiting for his judgment. "Enough," Ethan said, voice calm but carrying. "This isn't about shouting each other down. It's about understanding what Harold did and why." The crowd shifted. Some muttered agreement, others bristled. A younger man spat onto the floor. "Understanding. We've got skeletons in bags. People missing for decades. And you're asking us to trust a dog?" Shadow stepped forward, steady, deliberate. He didn't bare teeth, didn't lunge. He simply fixed his gaze on the man, golden eyes unwavering. The man froze, breath catching in his throat. A low growl rolled from Shadow's chest, not threat, but warning. The sound of a sentinel refusing to let fear choose the wrong enemy. The tension cracked, shoulders sagged, conversations dimmed to murmurs. "He's never been wrong," someone whispered. "That dog sees the truth." Ethan seized the moment. "Your stories matter." Every fight Harold had, every warning he gave, every odd disappearance. They're pieces of the puzzle, but tearing each other apart won't give us answers. We investigate, we listen, and we let the evidence speak. The storm in the room ebbed, leaving behind an uneasy quiet. People still argued in hushed tones, still doubted, but the fury had passed. Shadow padded back to Ethan's side, brushing his leg with silent affirmation. Chaos could be calmed, but vigilance was far from over. That night, silence draped the Rowan farmhouse, though it was fragile silence, the kind that breaks under the weight of memory. Lila tossed beneath her quilt, her breath shallow. The flickering lantern painted oak-shaped shadows on the wall, branches clawing at her imagination. Sleep dragged her into a dream, but it was not mercy. She was small again, crouched on the staircase, clutching her rabbit by its ear. Men shouted on the porch, voices jagged and furious. Her grandfather's roar cut through. "No one touches that tree. Not now, not ever." Shadow had been there too, younger, stronger, hackles raised, growl vibrating through the floorboards. She remembered the fear pressing against her ribs, the word that had seared itself into her. Buried. The dream darkened, roots curled like snakes. The oak loomed tall enough to blot the sky, its hollow pulsing with whispers she couldn't understand. She ran, but the voices followed. Her grandfather's rage, the stranger's threats, the endless growl of the dog guarding what she could not see. Then a bark split the dream, sharp, real. Lila's eyes flew open. Moonlight streamed through the window. Outside, Shadow stood in the grass, head high, ears alert, amber eyes glowing. He barked once more, not frantic but deliberate, a sentinel's call. "I am here. You are safe." She scrambled to the window, pressing her forehead to the cool glass. "Did you see it too?" she whispered, voice trembling. "The men? Grandpa? The tree?" Shadow stepped closer, tail stiff, chest broad, and let out a low whine. It was enough. He remembered. He had always remembered. Tears welled in her eyes, fear and gratitude mingling. "You never let the bad things win," she whispered. "You're brave, Shadow. I trust you. Always." The dog circled once, then sat beneath her window, muscles coiled, gaze fixed on the oak beyond the yard. The wind rattled the shutters, branches clawed the sky, but Lila's breathing steadied at last. She curled beneath her quilt, hands still pressed against the glass. Outside, Shadow kept his vigil, black fur glistening under the moon. The oak loomed in the distance, sinister and silent. But the child slept, because a shepherd stood guard. And in Raven Hollow, that was enough. For now. Dawn had barely begun to stain the sky when Raven Hollow awoke to a tension that clung to the air like a damp fog. The oak, now stripped of its last outer layers, stood gnarled and hollowed, a looming witness to decades of secrets. The earth around it was churned and pocked from hours of labor, shovels and pickaxes, leaving uneven scars. The smell of fresh soil mixing with the lingering tang of decay. Ethan crouched near the base of the oak, coat damp from dew, eyes narrowed against the pale light. Shadow sat beside him, ears pricked, tail low but still, the dog's body taut with anticipation. Even at this hour, the crowd of neighbors had begun to gather at a cautious distance, whispers threading through the crisp morning air. Some faces held fear, others morbid curiosity. All shared a common weight: the anticipation of revelation, the kind that made the blood run cold before the first clue even emerged. Deputies worked in disciplined silence, gloves smeared with dirt and rot as they carefully extracted fragments from the hollow. Each piece was placed on sheets of white plastic, the stark contrast highlighting the grim reality within. Ethan's hands rested on his knees, jaw tight. He had expected horror, yes, but nothing could have prepared him for the magnitude, the sheer number of secrets this oak had swallowed. Shadow's low growl punctuated the quiet murmur of the onlookers, a reminder that the dog sensed more than any human could yet comprehend. He pawed at a particular section of the hollow, claws scraping against bark and earth. Ethan leaned closer, following the direction of the dog's instinct, and deputies hesitated, recognizing the pattern. Shadow had guided them before, and now he was signaling with a precision that bordered on the uncanny. "Get the camera," Ethan muttered to a young deputy, voice tight with a mix of dread and urgency. "Document everything. Every fragment counts." The first pieces were small, brittle, and crumbling. Old clothing, the threadbare remnants of shoes, the faint hint of fabric patterns long out of fashion. But beneath them, unmistakable outlines of bone began to emerge. Not a single set, but multiple, fragmented, disarticulated, stacked in careful, almost deliberate concealment. Each discovery was met with a quiet intake of breath from the deputies, who quickly repressed any overt reaction. Ethan, however, could not look away. He felt as if the oak itself exhaled, releasing a history it had carried in silence for decades. The crowd had edged closer, though Sheriff Doyle's voice carried through the hush. "Back up! Let the team work!" Even as he spoke, his eyes flickered to Ethan and Shadow, silently acknowledging the bond that had uncovered so much already. Doyle's face was pale, lines of worry etched deeper than they had ever been. He had always trusted his instincts, but never had he faced a revelation of this magnitude. Lila and her mother stood to one side, arms linked, trembling as fragments of the oak's terrible history came to light. Lila's small hand rested on Shadow's flank, finding strength in the presence of the dog who had guided them through fear, uncertainty, and darkness. The innocence in her gaze contrasted with the gravity of the scene, a fragile thread of light in a tableau dominated by decades of human cruelty. Deputy Kota, who had worked the excavation with meticulous care, gently lifted another piece, revealing a hollow cavity previously unnoticed. The dog sniffed the opening, hackles raised, tail stiff. Ethan bent down, peering into the dark cavity, and swallowed hard. Inside were the unmistakable shapes of skeletal fragments, small, fragile, some no larger than a child's hand. The realization hit him with the force of a hammer. This was not the story of a single tragedy. The oak had become a vault of many silenced lives. "Holy," muttered one of the younger deputies, but Ethan raised a hand, silencing the murmur. This was not a spectacle, it was a revelation. The air felt charged, thick with the weight of history, pressing down on every living soul present. He felt Shadow stiffen beside him, growling low, eyes scanning the area, as though sensing the residual echoes of the people whose lives had been contained within these twisted roots. Each fragment was catalogued with care, bones that bore the signs of age, delicate teeth, small fingernails preserved in the dark soil. Every piece told a story, a hint of a life cut short, a testament to fear, secrecy, and perhaps the desperate attempt of one man, Harold, to hide or protect something he could not fully explain. The complexity of it gnawed at Ethan's mind. Who were these people? What had Harold known?
and what danger had driven him to conceal so many secrets within the oak's gnarled trunk. The crowd murmured now, whispers laced with fear and speculation. How many? Were they drifters? Did anyone ever notice they were gone? Ethan ignored the voices, focusing on the meticulous work of the deputies and the steady guidance of Shadow, who seemed more attuned than any human could be. The dog's instincts, honed by years of service, were now the compass, leading them through a landscape of human darkness. Time lost its meaning as excavation continued. The first shafts of sunlight pierced the canopy above, falling in dappled light on the hollow and its grim contents. Each ray illuminated fragments of bone, pieces of cloth, objects that had once been personal belongings. The sheer number, the careful concealment, the silence that had preserved them. Everything spoke of deliberate intent, not mere accident. Ethan's chest tightened as he thought of Harold. Was this a story of vengeance, of protection, or of madness? The man had lived quietly for decades, known as eccentric, temperamental, obsessive. But none could have imagined the vault he had become custodian of. Shadow nudged Ethan's hand with his nose, grounding him in the present, reminding him that even amidst darkness, there was guidance, loyalty, and vigilance. By mid-morning, the deputies had catalogued enough to understand the full scope. Multiple victims, carefully hidden, each fragment a piece of a puzzle long ignored. Sheriff Doyle approached Ethan, voice low, the weight of years of oversight pressing on him. We need to call in the coroner. Full investigation. This is bigger than we realized. Ethan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He felt the hollow in his stomach mirror the hollow in the oak, an emptiness filled with unspoken truths and silent witnesses. As the forensic team began to carefully package the first finds, Shadow remained at Ethan's side, eyes never leaving the oak. The dog's presence was a reminder that history, no matter how deeply buried, could not remain hidden forever. And for the first time, the people of Raven Hollow truly faced the scale of the darkness that had lain just beneath their feet, under the watchful gaze of the oak, under the guardianship of a dog who had refused to look away. Ethan took a deep breath, hands on knees, watching the deputies work with deliberate care. Lila clung to his arm, small and fragile, yet somehow steady, a silent promise that the next steps would be guided by courage and compassion, not fear. The oak had yielded its first truths, but Ethan knew there was more to come. More fragments, more stories, more reckoning. Shadow growled softly, as if echoing his unspoken thought. The hollow had spoken, but the story was far from over. By midday, Raven Hollow was unrecognizable. The oak, gnarled and hollowed, had become a magnet for whispers, rumors, and the distant hum of news vans rolling down the narrow roads. Once a quiet town, it now seemed to breathe under the weight of scrutiny, each leaf trembling as though aware that secrets long buried were clawing their way to the surface. Ethan stood a few feet from the tree, hands in his coat pockets, eyes tracing the hollow cavity where deputies and forensic teams meticulously continued their work. Shadow sat obediently at his side, ears pricked and body rigid with alertness, growling low at anyone who ventured too close. The dog's instincts had been unerring from the beginning, guiding them through decades of hidden terror. Now, they served as both shield and compass in a town suddenly stripped bare. The sheriff approached, his expression a mix of resignation and determination. Doyle's usual composure was gone, replaced with a raw vulnerability that few had ever seen. He stopped a respectful distance from Ethan, voice low, gravelly with emotion. Ethan, we need to face the truth. This town,
This place. We've ignored too much for too long. Raven Hollow has been holding its breath, but the air's gone stale with secrets. It's time to let the light in. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of Doyle's words. The sheriff's admission was more than procedural. It was a confession of negligence, of years where suspicions had been quietly dismissed, of the invisible line between denial and complicity. He could feel the tension radiating from Doyle, see the lines etched deeper into his face, and understand that the man carried a burden no one else could see. Around them, the scene had shifted from labor to theater. Press vans lined the roads, cameras aimed at the oak, their lenses capturing the gnarled bark that had concealed so much horror. Reporters whispered into microphones, scanning the crowd for reactions, their questions already forming in the air. Who were the victims? How long had this gone unnoticed? What role did Harold play? Ethan glanced at Lila and her mother, standing behind the tape, faces pale but resolute. Lila clung to Shadow's flank, small hands clutching the thick fur as though drawing courage from the dog's calm presence. The innocence of her trust was a stark contrast to the gravity of the day, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope and resilience could anchor the living. Sheriff Doyle straightened, raising a hand to silence the murmurs that rippled through the crowd. "Listen to me," he said, voice firm, yet carrying the tremor of long-suppressed guilt. Raven Hollow will no longer ignore its past. This isn't just about the oak, or the man who tried to protect its secrets. It's about every life we overlooked, every disappearance we failed to investigate, and every shadow we allowed to fester in silence. A low hum of acknowledgement rippled through the gathered townsfolk. Some shifted uncomfortably, faces a mixture of shame and curiosity. Others nodded, understanding the weight of the sheriff's words. The oak, still looming and hollow, seemed to absorb the moment, its twisted form a sentinel over both history and reckoning. From the edge of the clearing, an FBI agent emerged, her badge glinting in the morning sun. She spoke briefly with Doyle, voice clipped, professional, but her eyes scanned the excavation with a meticulous intensity that hinted at the magnitude of what lay beneath the oak. The hint of federal involvement sent a ripple through the crowd. Whispers of FBI and federal case threaded between neighbors like wildfire. Raven Hollow, long shielded by its remoteness and insularity, was now thrust into the wider world's gaze. Ethan's hands flexed at his sides, tension coiling in his muscles. He had guided the town to this moment, had followed Shadow's instincts to unearth truths that no human intuition had uncovered. And yet, even as the oak yielded its fragments and the first outlines of a larger narrative emerged, he knew the reckoning had only just begun. There would be questions, accusations, and uncomfortable revelations, not just about Harold or the victims, but about the town itself, about those who had seen, heard, and ignored. Shadow stirred beside him, a subtle nudge against Ethan's leg, grounding him. The dog's eyes were fixed on the hollow, as if aware that the true reckoning was not yet complete. Ethan followed the gaze, noting how the bark seemed to twist shadows into shapes reminiscent of the past, fleeting figures, small hands, and watchful eyes that would never be forgotten. Shadow's growl was low, but unwavering. A warning, a promise, a call to vigilance. As reporters began to set up microphones and cameras, Doyle continued, his voice carrying over the gathered crowd. "We will investigate thoroughly. Every piece of evidence, every lead will be pursued. I cannot undo what has been ignored, but I can ensure that justice, however delayed, will be sought. And let this be a lesson. No secret, no matter how deeply buried, is beyond accountability. The murmurs grew, some voices rising in protest, others in agreement. Arguments began to spark. Fingers pointed, tempers flared. But Ethan, with Shadow at his side, remained a pillar of calm authority. The dog's presence alone quelled the rising tension more effectively than any human voice could. Shadow had guided them through fear, through darkness, and now through judgment. His vigilance reminded the town that courage could manifest in silence, in patience, in an unwavering commitment to truth. Behind the crowd, deputies continued to work, unearthing more fragments with care and precision. Each piece added to the mosaic of the town's hidden past, and each discovery reinforced the sheriff's words. Raven Hollow could no longer pretend to innocence. The oak had been a vault, but it could no longer contain the secrets within its twisted trunk. Ethan looked at Lila, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear, and gently squeezed her shoulder. "It's going to be okay," he said softly, though the words felt fragile against the enormity of the day. Shadow nuzzled her hand, a quiet affirmation of the bond that had guided them all. In this moment, the town's past, present, and future converged under the gnarled branches of the oak, and the reckoning had begun in earnest. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the clearing. Cameras clicked, voices recorded, and the wind whispered through the leaves, carrying a message older than the town itself. Secrets left unspoken do not vanish. They wait, patient and enduring, until someone has the courage to confront them. And today, Raven Hollow had done just that. The sheriff exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands over his face, the lines of worry softened by resolve. "Raven Hollow," he said, louder this time, addressing both the crowd and himself. "We face our ghosts together, and we face them honestly. No more silence, no more hiding. Not now, not ever again." Ethan felt Shadow shift beside him, the dog's body vibrating with restrained energy, as if acknowledging the magnitude of their achievement. The oak stood behind them, hollow and scarred, yet a monument to truth and endurance. The first step had been taken. The town had begun its journey from superstition and fear toward accountability and healing. And though the path ahead was uncertain, the reckoning had begun, and Raven Hollow would never be the same again. Night had fallen over Raven Hollow, and with it came a stillness that was almost unnatural, as if the town itself were holding its breath. The golden light of street lamps pooled against the rough sidewalks, casting long shadows that stretched toward the oak, like the fingers of memory reaching across time. Inside the small farmhouse at the edge of the clearing, Lila lay curled under her quilt, a threadbare but cherished blanket that smelled faintly of lavender and home. In her tiny arms, she clutched her stuffed rabbit, ears bent from years of affection, eyes staring blankly as if bearing witness to a world she had only just begun to understand. Outside her bedroom door, Shadow rested, body rigid and alert. The German shepherd's coat shimmered in the muted light, filtering through the window, muscles taut beneath fur that gleamed like polished obsidian. He was more than a pet, more than a companion. He had become a sentinel. Each breath, each flick of his ears, was tuned to the subtle noises of the house, the creaks of settling timber, the distant wind that whispered through the hollow branches of the oak. Every fiber of his being radiated vigilance, a living testament to loyalty, courage, and the weight of secrets he had helped uncover.
Lila's small chest rose and fell in rhythm with the deep, measured calm that only sleep could grant her. Her forehead was furrowed in a faint expression, the traces of nightmares still lingering from earlier dreams. The echoes of her grandfather shouting at strangers under the oak, shadows twisting in her mind like smoke. Yet even in slumber, her trust was absolute. She had learned to place her faith in shadow, to believe that whatever darkness the world could offer, he would stand between it and her. Shadow's amber eyes, bright in the dim glow, remained fixed on the oak visible through the window. Its silhouette was stark against the night sky, twisted and gnarled, yet no longer merely a monument to fear. The tree now bore witness to the truth, to the horrors it had concealed and the justice it had silently demanded.
Shadow's gaze never wavered. He seemed to understand that vigilance was eternal, that the oak's hollow was not just a void, but a repository of memory, both tragic and instructive. Every leaf that shivered in the wind, every branch that creaked, carried the echoes of lives long hidden, lives that the town would never forget. The quiet hum of the night was punctuated only by the occasional rustle of a squirrel outside or the distant hoot of an owl, yet Shadow remained immovable. His ears flicked toward every minor disturbance, a footstep on gravel, a whispered conversation beyond the clearing, even the creak of the floorboards as the house settled. He was a living bridge between past and present, a guardian of memory, a protector, not just of Lila, but of the very truth that had been wrested from the hollow oak. Ethan lingered in the hallway, leaning against the doorframe. He observed the scene with a mixture of relief and reverence. The investigations had concluded for the night, the immediate danger contained, and yet he knew the town's recovery was only beginning. His gaze shifted from Lila to Shadow, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The dog's unwavering stance was a mirror of the steadfastness Ethan felt in his own chest. The kind of commitment born of shared trials, of confronting darkness together, of emerging scarred but unbroken. Outside, the oak's presence loomed like a shadow of memory, the wind teasing its branches into subtle, haunting gestures. Each movement whispered stories of the past, the victims long hidden, the secrets kept for generations, and the courage it took for a single town, a single community, to confront its buried truths. The oak was both a witness and a reminder, its hollow center now emptied of concealment, yet full of lessons etched in timber and memory alike. Lila shifted in her sleep, murmuring something indistinct, and Shadow's ears pricked further. He rose slightly, muscles coiled, eyes scanning every corner of the room, before settling back into his protective vigil. It was a silent promise, one forged through action and instinct, that nothing, no matter how unseen or sinister, would cross this threshold while he remained. For Shadow, the boundaries of protection extended beyond the physical. He was sentinel to fear itself, to memory, and to the fragile hope that children like Lila could sleep safely at night. Ethan's hands fell to his sides, the weight of exhaustion pressing into his shoulders. Yet there was also an unspoken pride, a profound respect for the canine who had guided them through darkness, who had not only saved lives, but illuminated the hidden truths of a community long mired in silence. The bond between man and dog had carried them through treacherous discoveries, from the first frenzied bark at the chainsaw to the solemn gaze upon the hollowed oak, and now into this quiet aftermath, where vigilance and peace intertwined. In the kitchen, the light from a lone lamp flickered, illuminating the papers and evidence Ethan had reviewed that day. Files detailing disappearances, investigations left incomplete, patterns that had gone unnoticed, all now laid bare, documented, ready to be confronted. The presence of justice, once deferred, now lingered in the air like a tangible force, interwoven with the comfort of the home and the silent guard keeping it safe. Shadow's attention never wavered. He had learned, over months and years, that the world held dangers far beyond what humans could see, dangers that lurked not only in the present, but in the echoes of the past. And yet, he had chosen his post, his role, with unwavering fidelity. Every muscle, every breath, every measured shift of weight was testimony to the steadfastness that defined him. He was not merely a companion. He was an arbiter, a guardian of both innocence and truth, a sentinel for the living and the memory of those lost. Outside, the wind rustled through the branches of the oak, carrying faint whispers of the town's collective breath, the sigh of long-suppressed memories finally surfacing. Shadow's ears twitched, his gaze fixed unwaveringly. Inside, Lila dreamed, perhaps of shadows transformed into light, of fears rendered powerless by courage and loyalty. And Ethan, standing in quiet watch, understood that the work of guardianship was both ongoing and deeply personal, a commitment that transcended the mere act of protection, entering the realm of the sacred. As the night deepened, a sense of calm settled over the farmhouse. The oak loomed in the distance, no longer merely a monument to superstition or fear, but a repository of truth. The town would never be the same. The past could not be undone, yet the present was preserved in the quiet moments of trust, vigilance, and the enduring bond between a girl and her dog. Shadow, still alert, still steadfast, remained the final emblem of that promise, a living sentinel, standing guard against the shadows, against forgetting, and against the recurrence of unspoken evils. And so, with the soft rise and fall of Lila's chest, the silent rustle of the wind, and the unwavering presence of shadow, Raven Hollow's story reached its resting point, not in resolution alone, but in the vigilance of those who remember, in the justice sought, and in the loyalty that endures beyond fear, beyond death, and beyond the passage of time. The oak watched, the wind whispered, and Shadow's amber eyes gleamed in the lamplight, the sentinel of a town, the guardian of truth, and the reminder that memory, like loyalty, is never truly silent. Watching Shadow stand guard, seeing the unwavering trust between Lila and her dog, reminds us of something simple but profound. The love we share with our animals is a language all its own. German shepherds, with their loyalty, intuition, and quiet courage, teach us about patience, devotion, and the deep bonds that can form without words. They show up in ways that matter most, often when we need them, and sometimes even before we realize it ourselves. If you've ever felt that special connection with your own dog, you know it's a gift worth cherishing. There are gentle ways to deepen that bond. Moments of quiet attention, shared walks, or learning to read their subtle signals. If you're curious, I've come across a place that shares ideas for connecting more deeply with your dog. It's just a resource, something to explore at your own pace. And honestly, sometimes the smallest gesture, a touch, a look, or simply being there, is all it takes to let your dog know they're loved and trusted. Yet give yourself the gift of noticing, and I promise, the love you feel will come back to you in ways you can't even imagine.